Welcome, Michael.
Hello.
Excited to see you here.
Thanks very much.
Welcome, everybody. Good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. My name is Andrea Soccorso. I'm proud to be a volunteer advisor to ClimateVoices and also the host and MC. I am also a co-founder of After We Vote, which is a pro-democracy club where we launched and came together on the other social audio app, Clubhouse. And also, I have had the honor to share as an advisor and director of partnerships to a Nobel Peace Laureate working on behalf of children around the world, Mr. Kailash Satyarthi. ClimateVoice was founded 2 years ago by Bill Weihl, who's up here on the stage next to me, who he used to head up sustainability at Google and Facebook when he left the corporate world to push companies to step it up on climate policy and offset the lobbying power of big oil. Thousands of employees and advocates have signed the 1 in 5 petition that his team have put together at climatevoice.org. That petition urges companies to spend more on pro-climate lobbying. So you can check out their website at climatevoice.org and the profiles of both ClimateVoice and Bill Weihl here on Twitter. I also want to say hello and recognize Jennifer Allyn, who's up on the stage next to Bill in the upper right-hand corner. Jennifer Allyn is the director of campaigns at ClimateVoices. And so some good news related to the 1 in 5 petition is an article in Protocol shared some information from a poll, the Harris poll, which shows that awareness has grown in general. I mean, that's the one bit of good news around the climate. That's the one bit of climate change news that is positive. 2/3 of U.S. adults, according to this poll, are concerned about tech industry impact on climate, and that tech firms, and they strongly believe that tech firms are obligated to take action. And there's also a growing movement of the industry's employees who are putting pressure on companies to lay out more ambitious plans and stick to them. So about the show ClimateVoices. ClimateVoices is a series of urgent conversations with people at the forefront of solving the climate crisis. Past episodes have featured leading thinkers and doers such as youth climate activists. In our last show, check that out in the climatevoice.org Instagram or Twitter Spaces. Links to that show. It was very inspiring. We've also had other leading climate scientists like Katharine Hayhoe, who wants us to keep hope in the arsenal or the war chest in the fight against climate, and award-winning innovator Saul Griffith, who wants us to electrify everything. So we are really looking forward to some inspiration tonight and some acceleration from this episode entitled Now or Never, What We Can and Must Do to Act on Climate, with one of our earliest guests, as we were just saying, with renowned climatologist Michael Mann. Tonight we have a conversation about the high cost of inaction on climate and the brief window of opportunity when Congress reconvenes for policy action. There is a tiny window of opportunity left to invest $550 billion in our clean energy future and to demonstrate to other global leaders the U.S. commitment to deliver on COP26 promises and enhance our credibility and leadership at COP27 this fall. So as we kick off, I want to acknowledge that last year when we talked to you, Michael, it was a very different world in many significant ways. And now we're at a huge hinge point with this legislation. It feels like we're on a hinge point with everything right now in history. And it's very timely to be having this conversation with you. But before I pass you the mic, I just want to make sure for any of you in the room who may not know Michael, which I find hard to believe, Michael Mann is a distinguished professor of atmospheric science at Penn State. He has tried his best to warn all of us with his famous hockey stick graph, which illustrates the rapid increase in global warming over time. Now, he's equally on point with his latest book, The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet, which is now available in paperback. And I just want to share that you have to read this book if you haven't. The breaking down of the spread of misinformation and disinformation, which is so rampant on so many subjects in our society right now, is hugely, hugely helpful. And so without further ado, I just want to welcome all our other panelists as well. We have Reverend Lennox Yearwood, who has joined us. He is president and CEO of the Hip Hop Caucus, the legendary Rev Yearwood. We have Wes Gobar. He is the coalition's lead at Evergreen Action. And we have Gabrielle Jorgensen, the advocacy director of Climate Changemakers. And then we have Jamal Lewis with us, director of policy partnerships and Equitable Electrification for Rewiring America. So tonight we'll kick off the conversation with a question from Bill. So Jennifer, shall I pass over to you and you can kick us off with these questions?
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks everyone for joining tonight. So, Bill is having an issue with his voice. And so we want to make sure that his voice and wisdom and insights are with us here today. So I'm going to ask some questions on his behalf. I'm going to ask some questions on my behalf. And then Bill is also going to type in and tweet and make sure that he's part of this conversation. So this first one, Michael, is from Bill. Every time a new IPCC report comes out, the message seems clearer, it's more definitive, and more dire. And two things seem crystal clear. One, we need to stop expanding fossil fuel extraction. And two, we have the technology to make rapid progress with wind, solar storage, EVs, heat pumps, etc. So what's your take on this April IPCC report and the world's reaction to its findings?
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Jennifer and Andrea and Bill. It's great to hear your climate voice virtually, even if we can't hear it directly tonight. We are at the crossroads. This was alluded to earlier in the conversation. We feel like we are at this critical juncture, and we are, because this window of opportunity that we still have to avert catastrophic warming of the planet, more than 1.5 Celsius or 3 degrees Fahrenheit warming of the planet. That window is disappearing. It won't be available much longer if we don't start to bring carbon emissions down dramatically. And look, there's a little bit of good news here at the same time. Not only sort of the shift in public opinion that was mentioned earlier, but the fact that the numbers, when you crunch through them, coming out of the Glasgow summit, which to some was a disappointment. There were high expectations, and they weren't. And for many folks, those expectations weren't met. But at the same time, there was real progress made there. And so, if we now total up all of the commitments from all the countries of the world, uh, for the first time, the projected warming now starts to come in under 2 degrees Celsius. That's still not low enough. We've got to keep it below 1.5 Celsius, but it does come down below 2 degrees Celsius, which is almost half of where we were headed, say, back at the time of the Paris summit. So we've made some real progress, but we've got a lot of work to do. And commitments are one thing. It's easy to talk the talk, but we need to walk the walk. And that means we need policies here in the US that, for example, allow the Biden administration to make good on its commitments under the Glasgow Agreement, a commitment to lower its carbon emissions by 50% within this decade. That keeps us on that track to keeping warming below that catastrophic 1.5 Celsius level. But it can't be done without legislation that codifies what the Biden administration has committed to, has agreed to, has proposed. So to get that legislation, as over the finish line, as we know, we haven't done it yet. It needs 50 votes through reconciliation to get something like the Build Back Better bill through. You need 50 Democratic votes and a tie-breaking vote by the vice president, and we're not there. We have two Democrats, in particular, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, who have stood in the way of passing that bill with those critical climate provisions in the bill, like the clean energy standard and subsidies for renewables, things, actual items within that bill that would allow us to meet that commitment of lowering our carbon emissions by 50%. And if we can't meet our commitments, then we don't have much authority on the world stage, and it gets very difficult to see the sort of global action that we need. So what it comes down to, there's still time. We have the technology to do this. We don't need a miracle, Bill Gates. Sorry, we have the technology to decarbonize our economy. What we need is the political will. And we need people, to use their climate voice to put pressure on our policymakers to vote and do everything we can to bring in climate advocates, to get rid of climate delayers, and finally get the action that we know we need here.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned the climate investments that are still on the table, because I do think, all of us were incredibly disappointed that Build Back Better didn't pass last year.
Yeah.
What should all of us in this audience be doing around getting corporate voices into this debate to push lawmakers? So companies are still hiding behind their trade associations. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable came out against reconciliation for a number of reasons, but didn't sort of full-throatedly endorse the climate provisions in the bill. So what is it going to take for companies to stand up and really push back on those kinds of associations and groups so that we get the meaningful change we need?
Yeah, and I think that's where this organization, ClimateVoices, is so critical, and the work that ClimateVoices is doing is so critical because, look, what many of these tech companies want to do is engage in greenwash. They want to sound like they're part of the solution because their customers, because the people expect them to be. You can't be on the wrong side of the defining challenge of our time, at least with sort of millennials and Gen Z folks. They expect some degree of corporate responsibility. And so these companies know that they have to talk the talk, but they're not walking the walk, right? They'll talk about the investments that they're making in decarbonizing their data centers, and that's true. But that's not what's going to get us there. What's going to get us there is policies that moves all of us collectively in the direction we need to go. And that means legislation. And right now, as you allude to, they are not standing, behind their principles when it comes to their participation in the political process. They continue, many of these, tech companies continue to provide funding for, groups like ALEC and the American Chamber of Commerce. They are still supporting groups who have worked actively, have not only not worked to advance progress, climate action, but have worked actively against it. They've attacked the science, they've attacked the scientists, and they have tried to discredit clean energy and any policies that will get us off fossil fuels. And so, if these tech companies really want to claim that they're with us in the defining challenge of our time, then they need to get off the sidelines. They need to stop supporting directly or indirectly polluters and the organizations behind them, and stand behind meaningful climate efforts like Build Back Better and the climate provisions in it.
Well, amen. We agree with you completely on that. So this next question is from Bill. You've written that doomism is a trap and that people need to have hope and agency to address climate. But many organizations and many companies are sort of focused exclusively on good news, the enormous business opportunity around climate solutions. And it seems to me, or it seems to Bill, that we need all three: urgency, hope, and agency. How do you suggest we sort of balance these and sort of don't just keep doing the pendulum between sort of optimism and pessimism?
Yeah, it's a great question, of course, and and it is always a challenge. We don't want to be Pollyannish here. We've, it's no problem. We're there. We're doing what we need to do, because we're not. We're not making the progress that's necessary. And any framing of the climate crisis that somehow implies that we don't need to do anymore, that we're already on the right path, takes the pressure off of polluters and those behind them. And so, at the same time, if we sort of follow the doomsayers who will try to convince us that it's too late to do anything, that we're already experiencing runaway warming and it's all over and we might as well just enjoy the ride. That is not scientifically defensible. That is simply not true. And it steals that agency from us. It robs us of that agency, this idea that it's too late when in fact it isn't. And so, we have to look at what the science actually says. And the science, fortunately, supports this sort of framing of urgency and agency. What the science tells us is there is still time to make the reductions in carbon emissions that will keep warming below a catastrophic 1.5 Celsius, 3 degree Fahrenheit, where we start to see the worst impacts of climate change. So we can prevent the worst impacts of climate change if we act now. And one of the things I've talked about is that the science over the last 10 years has, in fact, demonstrated that the reductions that we make now have an immediate and direct impact. If we stop putting carbon pollution into the atmosphere, the planet actually stops warming up. We used to think that there was still this sort of committed warming, that we would still see decades of warming if we stopped burning fossil fuels. Now we understand that the warming stops pretty quickly because, wow, there is this thermal inertia as the oceans continue to warm up. The oceans are also pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, and CO2 levels start to come down. So in the end, we can talk about a climate budget that allows us to say that there's this much carbon left that we can burn and keep the planet below this level of warming. And what it tells us is we still have a budget. There's still some carbon that we can burn and keep warming below that dangerous 1.5 Celsius, but there isn't much. And if you do the math, it's what tells us that we have to bring carbon emissions down 50% within this decade and all the way down to zero by mid-century.
Exactly. So, scientists have been warning us about this for ages, you in particular, and yet
I'm not as old as I might seem.
and in 2021, stories about the climate crisis were just 1% of overall coverage in corporate broadcast news. Why do you think the media is missing this story, and what should they be doing differently?
Yeah, so I do think some media outlets are doing a good job, and I know individual producers and shows. I've done a lot of interviews on MSNBC. Just today, I did an interview with Al Jazeera English and BBC the other day. So there are media outlets that do take this seriously, but they have to contend with management that wants to maximize profit. They continue to think, and I think wrongly, that climate is a ratings killer. We've even heard people like Chris Hayes of MSNBC, who is a major climate hawk. I mean, he has really devoted quite a bit of coverage to the climate issue over the years. He's very passionate about the climate crisis, and yet he was quoted saying that climate is a ratings killer. So even our friends, sometimes buy into this unhelpful framing that climate is a ratings killer. It's not. It's all about how we talk about it. And I really do believe that we have to talk about it in terms of the urgency that makes it a here and now problem. It's part of the daily news cycle. We're seeing the impacts of climate change play out now in the daily news cycle. So there's really an opportunity to connect it to the here and now. It's not just some theoretical far off problem. It's something that is impacting us and hurting us now. Deadly wildfires, floods, extreme storms. A little weird that it was snowing here in central Pennsylvania in late April today. Wacky weather. And we do think climate change is leading to some of that wacky weather. So we need to talk about it in a way that connects the dots, that makes it relevant to people's everyday lives, because it is relevant to people's everyday lives. And we have to offer that legitimate hope, not false hope, but legitimate hope. Because if we portray this, as a done deal, too late to do anything, then, we're basically telling people focus on all the other things that you have to worry about in your life, because there are a lot of things to worry about in the world right now. And it's very easy for an issue like climate to get squeezed out of the news cycle in favor of, understandably, the latest goings on in Ukraine, the latest developments in the ongoing assault on our democracy here in the United States. There are other big problems that we're dealing with right now. COVID, 19, we're still dealing with that as well. And it's understandable that there is, an overwhelming amount of media coverage there. But we have to make sure that there's time for the biggest crisis we face, because climate change is actually the biggest crisis we face in the end.
Absolutely. So I want to shift to another question from Bill, where he says, there's been a lot of attention on carbon removal lately. And my former colleagues in the tech world in particular have been trumpeting their commitments to buy carbon removal credits and the nearly $1 billion that they're committing. Now, you in the past described carbon removal as sort of a false solution. What do you think these companies are doing? Is it helping or hurting to divert the focus to this?
Well, the one carbon removal technology that would work would be a time machine, going back in time and just redoing it and not putting all that carbon into the atmosphere in the first place. That would be carbon removal, and that would be safe carbon removal. But in the real world, we can't do that. And in many cases, what people are talking about are sort of grand schemes that to date have not been demonstrated to be viable economically, physically, or scalable to the level that would be necessary. So we don't even have a coal capture, carbon capture and sequestration plant in existence that captures more carbon than it produces. And direct air capture, where we try to suck the carbon back out of the atmosphere, that is fighting the laws of thermodynamics and economics at the same time. And so, sure, it might be something that we keep in our hip pocket. We might need a stopgap sort of measure down the road if we find carbon dioxide levels continuing to climb and danger escalating, and there's no other option in sight. The problem is if we allow the promise of future technology that may or may not be viable, that may or may not be scalable in the end, if we allow that to be used as a crutch for polluters now to dampen efforts to solve this problem the safe way and the reliable way, by stopping the addition of carbon pollution into the atmosphere, by moving away from fossil fuel burning towards renewable energy. This is the safe and sensible way to solve the problem. And leading researchers like Mark Jacobson of Stanford, others at UC Berkeley, have demonstrated that we have the technology now to do this. And I'm repeating myself, but we don't need a miracle, as people like Bill Gates have said in the past. What we need is political will. And so it all comes down in the end to the same thing: the political will to solve this problem reliably and safely by decarbonizing our economy.
Why do you think it's such an appealing solution, though? Bill sort of describes it as he thinks the tech companies feel like it's heroic and it's sort of like them coming in to save the day. Because how can we make them feel heroic about pushing for public policy in DC, which is what we need?
Right. That seems very wonkish. It doesn't seem like the big, bold thinking that the tech world likes to sort of fashion itself as promoting, as being ahead of the curve. So I think Bill is exactly right about that. I think it appeals to the sort of nerd, in the tech, the nerdiness in the tech industry. And I can say that in a self-deprecating way because I was a physics major, physics and applied math at UC Berkeley undergraduate. I was a total nerd in high school and college. I understand that mentality. I was a physicist. I was, all but dissertation. I was going to do my dissertation in theoretical physics before I switched into climate science. And so I understand that mentality, that idea as a physicist or an engineer that, hey, we've got these amazing tools, the laws of physics, we can use them to solve big problems. We've done that historically. We've solved so many problems. We've created such important technology by developing and applying our knowledge and discoveries in science. And so I think there is this tendency when you come from that world, you come out of that world, which I do. There's a tendency to think, it's sort of like, if every problem looks, if your only tool is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. It's sort of this idea that if you come at this from a technocentric view, then these problems look like technological problems. And so you have people like Bill Gates say, well, I don't know the problem to the politics here, but here's some technological, things that I think we can do. I think if you don't know the solution to the politics of this problem, you don't actually know the solution to this problem, because the problem is one of politics at this point. It isn't one of technology. So I think that is part of the problem, the thinking that, that it's just a technological problem and that we can, as physicists are taught to do, find solutions to problems. It's what I did, find solutions to problems. And when you specify the sort of boundaries of that problem too narrowly, then you end up proposing potentially the wrong solutions, because here the solution isn't physics, it's politics.
No, that's so insightful, and we got to get that message out. So I have one more question for you before we invite in our panelists, and Andrea is going to moderate the panel. But information is a problem too. And we saw spikes in climate disinformation, right, during COP26, throughout the debate about Build Back Better, throughout the war in Ukraine in terms of around fossil fuel energy. So, what can we be doing to counter disinformation to make sure that, again, all of us who care about this issue have the right information to take the right action?
And
Yeah,
Jennifer, Michael, can I just add a quick thing on
yeah,
there at the end as well, which is Jennifer's question also in the context of the upcoming elections, combating that
yeah.
misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, it's this is one of the great challenges we face right now, and it isn't just climate. I mean, I sometimes think that as a climate scientist, we sort of saw this problem decades ago when there was this bad faith effort to discredit the science of climate change decades ago by fossil fuel interests and those promoting their agenda. So I sometimes feel like this, almost like it was a local cancer that impacted the public discourse over climate, and now it has metastasized to infect our entire body politic. So, sort of the rejection of science, of the rejection of basic facts, the idea that we are entitled to alternative facts. It's something that the great Carl Sagan back in the mid 1990s prophesied, with foreboding, the possibility that this is where we would be decades from now. That the forces of pseudoscience, and he was mostly focused on pseudoscience. I don't think that he was thinking quite as much about ideologically motivated anti-science, but he talked about a world where um, there would be a celebration of ignorance, and that's where we are now. We've seen that in the COVID debate, we've seen that in the climate debate, and we see that in pretty much every political debate we have, where there are conspiracy theories that have no intellectual merit. There's no basis for them in rational thought, and yet they have a grip on our politics. That's the larger problem we have to solve. And honestly, I don't know the solution to that larger problem. But in the meantime, we have to fight all of these smaller battles at the same time. We don't have time on climate. We don't have the luxury of waiting 10 years or 15 years. We've got to act now. And so to me, what that means is a little bit of triage. Yeah, there are climate change deniers out there, but they're not really getting much play in the media because their claims are no longer tenable. People can see climate change is happening. People can see the impacts with their own two eyes. So it's easy to get drawn into debates and back and forths on social media with climate change deniers, and they sort of just drag you down into this mud fight. And it's like the pig, don't get into a mud fight with a pig. The pig, will I forget exactly. The pig is better at it than you are and enjoys it. And so it's easy for us to waste too much time trying to convince trolls on the internet that they're wrong, when in fact what they're really looking to do is to waste your time. What we need to do is to focus on what I call the confused middle, not the people who are ideologically motivated to deny the climate crisis, but people of good intentions and goodwill who have been caught in between, who are sort of in the crossfire, who are in a sense victims of the disinformation campaign. Those are the folks we have to reach out to, because what we don't need everybody on board. No political movement has ever had everybody on board. What we need is an actionable majority of Americans and people across, the world, of course. But here in the United States, what we need is an actionable majority, and we need to get people who care about climate to turn out in every single election, not just presidential elections, midterm elections, and off-term elections as well. Because we don't turn out, the other side is very good at turning out their people, and any gains that we might make, it's one step forward and then it's two steps back. And that's sort of where we are right now on climate, lacking the votes that are necessary to move a climate agenda through the US Congress.
Thank you so much for that. So, Andrea, I'm going to give it back to you for our panel.
Thank you, Jennifer. And couldn't have been a more perfect segue than talking about also trying to use our democracy as a way to combat climate change and get done everything we need to do. I'm really excited for this great panel that we have tonight to join the conversation with Michael Mann. I think we will start first and welcome Rev Yearwood, who's up here next to me on the stage. Rev, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing awesome.
Thank you.
Always good to see my brother, Professor Michael Mann, doing his thing. So this is a great thing.
Well, thank you so much also for joining us.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what he's saying is spot on. I think for me, one of the things I would just add on top of that is that obviously we know that either you shape policy or policy shapes you. So clearly, this is a moment here where we have to be very serious about climate legislation. And I think that what we're seeing now, we feel like we've been here before, right? From what we did from the Waxman-Markey bill and the ACES process to where we are now with Build Back Better. It feels a little bit like, unfortunately, deja vu with a time clock. That's not in our advantage. So I think we're in a critical moment. The one thing I would say though is that I want to just kind of challenge our movement though. I do think we are challenging our opposition, which we should. We should challenge the fossil fuel industry at every point in turn we have. But I think that recently we need to also challenge ourselves. And when we think about the wins in our movement recently, obviously your mind goes to the young people, your mind goes to Standing Rock and all the amazing pipeline fights, wins that have been happening across the country. The work of Black and Brown people pushing for Justice 40, which is now a part of this administration's emphasis around environmental justice. So I would just say this to add on to what Professor Mann was saying, that I would challenge our philanthropy to also challenge how they're approaching this work. The New School did a study in which they looked at 12 foundations who were giving out $1.3 billion a year. And out of that $1.3 billion, only 1.3% went to BIPOC organizations. And so that's a terrible number. And so I'm happy to have folks like the Donors of Color, and folks like Hip Hop Caucus are pushing for that change, because the one thing that we have to have is we have to ensure, if we're talking about a transition on one side, but we're not doing a transition on our own side, we're not going to be successful. So I just want to add that to the conversation, but definitely looking forward to a conversation here with my other panelists, especially my brother West Gobar, for every action.
Well, thank you, Rev Yearwood. I just wanted, Michael, did you want to quickly? I do have another question for him, but do you want to respond to him?
Oh, sure. I just want to thank the Reverend for the very kind remarks and the very thoughtful remarks as well. And they're spot on as far as I'm concerned. The energy in the climate movement right now is coming from, the environmental justice movement, the climate justice movement. It's actually what sort of moved Joe Biden to take a much bolder stance on climate and issue those very bold executive actions at the beginning of his administration, because he understood that he got elected because of the energy right now in the party behind issues of environmental justice and climate justice. And so now, of course, we've got to get those policies over the finish line, but they probably wouldn't have even been on the table if it weren't for the organizing and the efforts by people down in the trenches, the pipeline protests, and just the energy and the youth energy and the energy in the climate and environmental justice movement. That's sort of what got us as far as we've gotten. Now we've got to get over, we finally have to sort of get over that final hurdle.
No rest for the weary. Um, back to Rev Yearwood. Can you tell us a little? I'm sure most people here are familiar with the Hip Hop Caucus and your work there, but you founded it back in 2004. Can you tell us a little bit about it and what made you start it, and what do you think the biggest wins are to date from your work there?
Yeah, well, we got started back in 2004. At that time, we were working on primarily democracy. Most people actually remember our voting campaign, which was Vote or Die, which actually has now morphed into Respect My Vote. But that was kind of what we were known for, a lot of our voting work in democracy. And then Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005, 17 years ago. And when that hit, me being from the Gulf Coast and from Louisiana, even though I was in Washington, D.C. at the time, seeing your family and friends drown and left behind in the richest country in the world is something that just moves you. And then, so since that time as an organization, Hip Hop Caucus literally got involved. And what's interesting about that too is that when they got involved, they were actually first people kind of put them into a silo. They were like, okay, most of you are just young people, brown, indigenous, male, female, queer, gay, straight, young people of color. We're going to put you into this box. And people are like, no, we're not going to be in that box. It's one of the things I said in the very beginning, we wanted to have what is now an intersectional environmental movement. Shout out to Leah Thomas with a book out on that right now. But we really felt it was important for us to break down the silos. And we realized that the climate movement, unfortunately, that time, and even today to some degree, was a siloed, segregated movement. But we wanted to break it down because we realized as humans, all of us coming together, we needed to fight that battle. So we've been fighting that battle ever since, and really at the forefront, right there, on many issues, as we mentioned. There's fights from the pipeline fights, there's been fights in regards to issues regarding environmental justice, been fights to connect the dots between climate justice and racial justice. And just really also now, I think our big thing has been trying to broaden the movement. We realize now that the fossil fuel industry is just too big and too powerful as it is now. We have to have a larger brand movement, a lot on storytelling and narrative organizing. And we're just super excited about that work as well, to really see how we can use things from film, documentaries, and music, and whatever we can, to be honest, to help spread the word, to help increase and grow our movement. But the one thing I'll just say this in closing, I'll just say this, and I hope people will go to our platform at hiphopcaucus.org, or you'll go to our Think 100%. This is the one thing I think that is critical right now, I think, for our movement, is that we are actually winning. That's the one thing. I think time is, I'll be very clear, time is not on our side. For many young people, so there's a lot of anxiety. They realize that our parents fought for equality in the 20th century, and they are now fighting for existence in the 21st century. So there's a lot of anxiety, to be very clear on that. And Professor Mann has talked about how we're not doing what we need to do in regards to the IPCC report and many other things. It's terrible when you see scientists gluing themselves to doors to try to bring awareness to this. But where we are now, we are in a position where we are shifting and we're having climate good news and climate wins. But again, it will take us as a movement to get out of our own silos. And in some cases, it's not to just learn things about the climate crisis, but to unlearn some things that we have about what we think can win and what can't win. And so I'm excited about that. I'm excited about what we're doing Hip Hop Caucus, but I'm excited as a movement, particularly what I believe is a BIWOC, a Black, Brown, Indigenous, women of color leaderful movement. And I think our movement being led by women is actually what will help us to succeed. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited what we're seeing, but we have to just make sure we do all we can, put our bodies against the gears of the machine to bring it to a grinding halt.
I love it. Put our bodies against the grind of the machines, 100%. Michael, did you want to jump in?
I was just going to say amen.
Amen. I want to bring in some other voices, but I'm going to ask you this question now, and we'll come back to you. So I'll give you time to figure out an answer to it. If you can tell me in like 30 seconds at the end what you're excited or what you not excited, what you are hopeful about as you look towards COP27 and the outcome of that. But right now I'm going to go to Gabrielle. Can you describe the mission of Climate Changemakers for us and how you inspire people to make climate advocacy a habit?
Hi, thanks, Andrea. I have to say I'm feeling really inspired after hearing Rev Yearwood, and so I'm gonna ride that wave of inspiration to talk about climate change makers because the issue that Professor Mann was talking about, that climate change is fundamentally a political problem and not as much a technological problem, is exactly the entire what the entire founding of climate change makers was based on. So, Climate Changemakers is a community of climate concerned people who are gathered together to take meaningful climate action. And while we're not partisan, we are very unapologetically political. And so, the impetus for this really came from this data that was published by the Yale program on climate change communication. And basically, what they found, so they do these annual surveys every year. I'm sure a lot of people on this call have seen this data. It's been really eye opening on a lot of fronts. But one of the findings was that, of every American that they surveyed, only 29% of Americans responded that they would be willing to take political action on climate, just in general, and that 1% was doing it currently. And so that leaves this 28% that are willing but not currently doing it. And one interesting aspect of the way they asked the question was, would you be willing to take political action on climate if someone you liked and trusted asked you to? And so all of these 28% of Americans, which is, if we got every single one of them, more than enough to have a successful political movement, are really just waiting to be asked by someone. And so we have tried to create a space where not only do we kind of catalyze a habit for people. So, you show up once a week. We host these hours of action, and you show up once a week and you take political climate action with us. But then in turn, you sort of become a connector and you figure out other people to ask. And this is very similar to this relational organizing concept that we see in elections work. And so all of these people are coming on Zoom and part of our community, and then they're going out and bringing more people. And that's created a sort of amazing multiplier effect. And the way that we get them to create a habit out of political climate action is really through creating resources that set you up for success before you even join the Zoom. So we are just not in the business of forcing people to become experts. Professor Mann is the expert, but not everyone needs to be when you're talking about these really important, mission critical climate policies. And so you show up on Zoom, we have these digestible issue briefings that talk about things like, the Build Back Better legislation that's kind of idling in the Senate right now. And it's really just all the information you would need to know to sound well informed and create personalized communication about it. And we also create these playbooks that go alongside those issue briefings. And the playbooks really focus on high impact, or what we consider high impact advocacy, based on best practices about what members of Congress and other decision makers really want to hear, and what would really move them to act. Because a lot of clicktivism, a lot of things that you can do with just the press of a button aren't really enough. Signing a petition often isn't really enough. You need to be able to communicate why you, as a constituent of those members of Congress, really care about the issue, and how you're going to hold them accountable as their constituent. And so these playbooks span the gamut of a lot of different types of advocacy. Some of them are reaching out to banks and utility companies, key stakeholders in the ecosystem of policymaking, while others focus on how to communicate about climate. So borrowing from Dr. Hayhoe's playbook on being an effective communicator, and then of course direct policymaker outreach. So we do a lot of emailing with personalized emails to specific senators, specific House reps, making phone calls, and the biggest, most impactful action of all, of course, scheduling constituent meetings with congressional staff. And so week after week, we have different themes for what types of actions people are going to take, keep things a little bit different so that people want to keep coming back, but also trying to keep them very focused on specific campaigns so that we can concentrate our advocacy on the issues of the moment.
Well, I'm inspired now. I can't wait to. I have to come to one of these action hours. That's
You
very.
do.
I do.
We're hosting one on
Everyone
Wednesday.
follow Gabrielle and go to a climate action hour with her. That sounds fantastic. I'd love to bring in Wes now. Wes, welcome back. It's great to see you again. The question we have for you is, how can companies help move the climate policy agenda forward in Congress? Let's get into the nitty gritty. Tell us what hopeful trends you see in the policy arena and what everyone here in the room can do.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I had a little dread when you called Yearwood first. I was like, man, I'm gonna have to follow him. Tough act to follow, but
No one wants to follow.
no, but in all seriousness, that I don't think people realize that this next 2 to 3 month period, 2 month really is our last and best chance to act on climate at scale. And the U.S. as a nation is not going to get a better shot than the 117th Congress we have right now. And all of the companies and corporations listening and the listeners will not have a better opportunity to have federal action, the weight of the U.S. federal government to fight the climate crisis than we have right now. And Dr. Mann was talking about the moment and how, it's never too late to act, and there's a lot of doomism. And I think that's a lot of this true. We're recognizing that this is also a pivotal window to where we have a Democratic trifecta, and we're at this beginning point of this pivotal decade of where we have to half emissions by half. And, people don't really realize that they're living in the middle of history until it's past them. And the House right now already passed this $555 billion in climate investments. It's just sitting there, and it's just waiting for the Senate to reach a deal and act. And the Senate will go to the midterms in June or July. If they don't have a bill, they will not come back to reconsider that legislation. And so they're going to come back to recess on next week, April 25th. And they have to put climate first on the agenda. They have to make a deal. Senator Manchin has said that he's interested in coming back to the table in reconciliation and making a deal. And we just have to make sure we prioritize these next few weeks that Senator Schumer, that Democratic leadership, but all the Senate, that they hear from us, that they hear from companies, because there are tons of opportunities to get involved, and companies. Even the low-lying fruit. Our partners, Project Drawdown, had an ad in the New York Times a couple months ago, and it was very inoffensive. It just said, we're calling on the White House and Congress to support to pass bold climate action. Didn't get into specifics. Didn't say pass the Clean Electricity Standard. Didn't say pass the Civilian Climate Accord. Just said bold federal climate action. And there are lots of companies who, like to consider themselves climate leaders, or to, put on green branding, and they initially committed and they backed out. And so now is the time to really step up. Now is the time to put your name on things. Now is the time to reach out to your Senate, to your contacts in Congress. Now is the time to sign that letter. Now is the time to reach out individually, because they need to hear from the business community. This is an economic issue, right? So it's always been, climate crisis has always been an economic issue, but it could be ignored when it was Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Maria destroying certain communities, or when Black and brown communities are choking on and dying on fossil fuel pollution. But right now, it's so large that it threatens the fiber of every economy. It's impossible to ignore. We have this opportunity with Ukraine, where we are seeing an unprovoked war that is literally funded by fossil fuels, and it's a national security issue. And we have to switch to rapidly have a just transition to clean energy, and we cannot let another opportunity to pass us by. So this window is actually really, really one of our best chances to get maximal action on the climate crisis from a federal level over the next 10 years.
Thank you, Wes. I'm looking up my senator's phone number as I'm listening to you, and I'm getting ready to book a ticket to go down to DC and sit out in front of everyone's office until I get a meeting with them. So I just want to go back to Gabrielle, and just ask you, just to mix up the conversation. So every week when you host these hundreds of change makers on the policy landscape, um, in the hour of action, which of the climate solutions do you feel are the most and the least in reach to be enacted this year? What do you talk about with your hundreds of change makers?
Well, this year so far have definitely been focused on federal level legislation in our advocacy. And so, based on a lot of the conversation you've heard tonight, there's definitely still a window open for passing that giant $500 billion climate investment that was passed by the House. And so, that's really that, and a couple other pieces of legislation at the federal level are what we focus on. I would say that I wouldn't necessarily count those in the most likely climate policies to be enacted this year. I mean, one thing that I'm really excited about is this SEC climate risk disclosure rule that passed preliminarily within the SEC a couple weeks ago, that would require public companies to disclose emissions to shareholders. I think that's something that people in the climate community had been fighting for a long time, because the more information that's provided to investors about scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions, the more they can push companies, right? Because that's a financial risk for investors that's being illuminated. And so we're in a 60-day comment period for that SEC rule, but it's pretty likely that it will pass a final vote, and then that's something really concrete that we could see happen in 2022. I think that, and the implementation of all the climate provisions that were passed in the bipartisan infrastructure bill last year. So it wasn't a ton of money for climate, but there are a lot of really important EV charging infrastructure, transmission upgrades, things like that are, now we're at this point where the states are now working with the federal government to actually implement that stuff. So that's some really tangible policy change we could see this year. But as Wes mentioned, we're in an extremely tight timeline for this giant investment package that's sitting basically at Joe Manchin's doorstep. And we need really concentrated pressure from everyone in the Senate right now if this is going to be something that we can realistically pass before the midterms. So just want to echo that urgency. we are doing a 30-day challenge with the filmmaker Adam McKay, who made Don't Look Up. We're calling our senators every single day for a month. We have 17 days left. So everyone listening, if you want to join us and tag 30 Days of Climate and tag Adam McKay, we can hopefully get this through before the window closes, and I won't regret getting up here and saying we still have a chance at passing it.
Gabrielle, so is Adam McKay making these phone calls himself with you?
He's making them. Yeah, he's making them every day. He actually spontaneously committed to this at one of our events that we co-hosted with MCJ. He just pledged that he was going to take action every single day, and he's been showing his receipts. He's been tweeting about his calls.
Fantastic. I love it. That's what we need to see, not just making the film, but then calling Congress. Let me bring Jamal into the conversation. Welcome this evening, Jamal. I hope you're well. We'd love to know why you think it's important. We've heard from Saul. It was a great Climate Voices show when we had Dr. Saul Griffith, author of Electrify Everything. So excited that he was with us. And now it's a pleasure to have you on the stage as well. Tell us why it's important to electrify everything and what obstacles you're seeing across the United States.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm first going to just describe electrification. Electrification is the process of transitioning from fossil fuel powered machines to ones that are powered by clean, renewable electricity. And we must electrify everything because it is the best, most effective method of reducing our emissions to prevent the worst of climate change. We are not going to efficiency our way to zero emissions. It doesn't matter how efficient a fossil fuel powered machine is, it will still emit, and we can't afford that. Electrification is about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also about cost savings, energy security, health, and justice. At least 87% of households in the United States, that's 104.7 million households, could save $37.3 billion a year on energy bills if they were using modern electrified furnaces and water heaters instead of their own current machines. And of those households, about 45% of those are low and moderate income. Again, electrification is also about energy security. So households using natural gas paid up to $500 more on their energy bills as compared to those using electric heating sources, which paid just $21 more this past heating season. And we also know from recent studies coming out of Stanford that electrifying household appliances would address the 42% increased risk of children experiencing asthma symptoms associated with gas stove use. So that's also really important. And we also know that electrification is a justice issue as well. Black households have the highest energy burden, meaning they pay amongst the highest percentage of their income on energy bills, which also makes us more susceptible to volatile fossil fuel prices. And Black households have the highest risk of developing and suffering from asthma and other respiratory illnesses. So when we electrify, it's about greenhouse gas emissions, but it's about a lot more than that. One of the biggest obstacles that I'm seeing is inertia. And I'll talk about that in two ways. The first is the continued subsidization of the fossil fuel industry by our government, which gives the false impression that fossil fuels are more affordable. Our government needs to stop subsidizing fossil fuels and instead pass the climate provisions in Congress, which I know has been talked about a few times tonight, which includes the Zero Emissions Homes Act, which would increase the affordability of electric appliances by providing rebates to everyday consumers. The second is inertia amongst households. At Rewiring America, as you all know, we are largely focused on the decisions that we as consumers can make. Our co-founder, Saul Griffith, found that 87% of our country's emissions come from the energy sector, and 42% of those emissions come from the decisions that we all make at the kitchen table. These decisions are about the machines that we choose to heat and cool our homes, cook our food, and drive us to and from work or home. I say this, but I'm 28 years old, and my parents have a furnace that's older than me. It's really important that when it comes time for replacement, that we're replacing these appliances with clean, renewable electric versions, or else we're just locking in, up to 30 years of emissions. It's really important that we're electrifying everything, and we're doing it now.
The furnace that's older than you. Oh gosh. I want to pause for a minute and ask. I know that we're reaching the end of the hour. We just have a couple of questions, but I would like to pause and invite Dr. Mann for a response.
Thanks. I just think that there were a lot of great comments made by all of them. We have our work set out for us. We know what has to be done. The solutions exist. It's about political will and getting this thing over the finish line. And the next month or two is going to be critical. It might be our best opportunity to get these climate provisions passed before we get into the heart of the midterm election. It'll be very difficult to get anything passed in that environment. And so it's sort of now or never for the near term if we're going to get these provisions that are absolutely essential. Because look, what it comes down to in the end is that without leadership by the United States, we're not going to solve this problem. We are the world's greatest legacy polluter. We put more carbon pollution into the atmosphere than any other country. If we're not out in front leading on this issue, then it's not going to happen. So, as goes domestic climate policy, goes global climate policy at this point. And that's why it's just so essential. The organizing, everything we've heard tonight, it's all hands on deck. Now is our time, and we have to make sure to take this opportunity.
Thank you, Michael. So call your senators and take part of the hours of action with Gabrielle. But so on that note, that's a perfect segue to Rev Yearwood. If you could just share your thoughts on what you're hopeful about the upcoming COP27 in this fall.
Yeah, before I get to COP27, let me just follow my brother, Dr. Mann, and say this Saturday, let's get it. There's a rally at the White House. At 1 o'clock, at the White House first, 1 o'clock. If you're in the D.C. area, anywhere close to it, 1 o'clock at the D.C. There's a fight for our future right on this issue of this legislation. This is our last best chance. If you go to fightforourfutures with an S.com, you can probably find a rally in your area. But let's start Saturday. Let's not wait. Let's start. Let's get it. I believe that organized people beats organized money every single time. So I don't want it to lose with us. I want it to be the winners on this. I think leading to COP, I'm excited from the standpoint that, this COP is going to be important because it's considered the Africa COP and it's in Egypt. I do think that we have to transition, I said earlier, to a different conversation in which our movement begins to look at how everybody can get involved. And I think we're doing that through our philanthropy, through our organizing, and through just from a standpoint of the world. And I think that we're at this moment. And so I just want to tell everybody to be encouraged. I don't care who you are. If you are up there and doing this work like Professor Mann, or you're over there doing it like Wes or Gabrielle or Jamal or whoever, I want you to know that we're all in this together. We really are. It really is all of us. Even those on the other side, we're all in this together. And I just really believe that we as humans, if we come together, we can win. And so let's make sure, if nothing else, even if we were to fail and we don't do it, let's make sure the next generation knows that, man, that group from 2022 and 2023 and 2024, they were some amazing humans, and they put it all on the line. So my dear sister Andrea, thank you so much as always. Let's go get them.
Let's go get them. Indeed. Let us go get them. Jennifer, I think, we've had some really great comments from Bill in the chat saying that Michael, nerds are the best. but I want to pass it back to you, Jennifer, to share some closing comments from Bill and kind of take us on out?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Andrea. So Bill and I want to first thank you for being our outstanding MC as always. Michael Mann, it has been such a pleasure to talk with you again. You're so eloquent, insightful, and so accessible. I love the way you frame the issues, and it's so, so important. Wes, Gabrielle, Reverend Yearwood, and Jamal, thank you for joining us. I hope everyone feels as inspired as we do that we can take action today, tomorrow. Please follow us on Climate Voice. We need to unlock the power of companies to push for climate policy. We have all of this influence personally, professionally, as employees, as citizens, as voters. So I think let's go get them. And please keep in touch. Look out for a recording of this conversation, share it with your friends, spread the word, and then please join us for our next Climate Voices, which you will find here on Twitter again. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night and raise your climate voice for change.
Thanks.
Let's go get them.
So long, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.